were sitting at a picnic table, and we sat there and we said, why the hell aren't there more women? And so out of that, WTF was born.
So welcome everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your day to join the Women's Tech Forum Masterclass on Inclusive Leadership. My name is Christine Popp, and I'm the Vice President of Wholesale Solutions here at Rogers Communications, based out of Toronto. First of all, a big thank you to the Women's Tech Forum. It's both a pleasure and an honor to work with WTF at Rogers, and especially to present this session on the top 10 traits of inclusive leaders. At Rogers, we're committed to building a more inclusive future for our team members and all Canadians. As part of our ongoing inclusion and diversity strategy that is embedded across our business, we're focused on ensuring that women, people of color, LGBTQS+, Indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities feel included in our culture and our workplace as leaders, as co-workers, and as voices for positive change, and on using our assets and partnerships to drive positive change for equity-seeking customers and the communities in which we work and live. We've made a lot of progress on our I&D journey, yet we all have more to learn, which is why I'm so excited to see what this session has to offer. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for the day. We have Lucy Sanders, NCWIT CEO and co-founder, and Nancy Phillips, Flexential Chair of the Board and Managing Director of Rallyday Partners. Over to you, ladies.
Thank you, Christine, and so glad to be with you. Lucy and I are thrilled to be here with you today talking about one of our absolute favorite topics, leadership and how each of us can become a change leader when it comes to inclusion. The WTF mission is near and dear to me. I have to tell you, I so agree with where the hell are all the women and why aren't there more? As a woman who built an infrastructure business, I can count on one hand the number of industry women I met along the way. I used to joke that the only upside was that there was never a lineup at the ladies' room during industry conferences, but kind of a sad statement, isn't it? I'm so pleased that you are out there building something really quite incredible in what I think is one of the most amazing sectors to be in, which is infrastructure. I want to thank you for building a community of women who are striving to tackle intersectionality in an honest, transparent, and helpful way. I mean, our talk today will only reinforce your commitment to have those tough conversations and grow as individuals, professionals, a community, and as an industry. So with that, I'd love to turn it over briefly to Lucy to do a quick introduction, and then we'll talk a little bit about who NCWIT is.
Thanks, Nancy, and good day, everybody. I'm Lucy Sanders. I'm the CEO and co-founder of NCWIT, and before that, I was an R&D vice president and fellow at AT&T Bell Labs working on telecommunications infrastructure. So I too share a lot of common experiences with everybody in this session, and I'm super excited to be here to talk about inclusive leadership today. So very happy to be here, and I can hand it back to Nancy in just a minute. I did want to say something about inclusive leadership. Our goal today is to leave the session thinking through how can we all be better inclusive leaders. And simply stated, inclusive leaders have inclusive organizations and they lead inclusive organizations. And we'll talk more about what that really means in a minute. But in the meantime, Nancy, I think you were going to go through a few details on NCWIT.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Lucy's very humble. She truly is one of these amazing rock star individuals in the tech community, and the impact that she is making across the country and quite frankly internationally in terms of how we think about DEI in general is really quite amazing. So I'm honored to share the session with you today here, Lucy. Lots to learn. I learn something every single day from Lucy, so thank you. I'm Nancy Phillips. I am the former CEO and founder of ViaWest and serve as the chairman of the board of Flexential, which is a combination of ViaWest and Peak 10. I am also a founder and managing partner of a private equity firm called Rallyday Partners, and we are focused on the lower middle market. And I also proudly serve as the chairman of the board of the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network, where we spend time working with CEOs to help them scale their businesses effectively. But my absolute favorite job is chairman of the National Center for Women in IT. It is truly an extraordinary organization and been an honor for the last, I think I'm 13 years into 16 years of being part of the NCWIT movement to really move big boulders and change in terms of the way we think about inclusion and diversity, especially within the tech community. So NCWIT is a nonprofit community founded in 2004 with support from the National Science Foundation. Yes, data matters, science matters, and it is at the heart of what we do. We basically convene, equip, and unite more than 1,400 change leader organizations to increase the meaningful and influential participation of all women at the intersections of race, ethnicity, class, age, sexual orientation, and disability status in the influential field of computing, particularly in terms of innovation and development. If COVID has taught us anything, it is that everything has accelerated, and computing and innovation matters more than ever. And so what we'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what inclusive cultures mean and how you as leaders, all of us as leaders, have a role in that. So let's jump in and talk about what you can do as a change leader in your organizations to advance an inclusive culture. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lucy.
Thanks, and we'll go to the next slide. So let's talk a bit about inclusive leadership. I mentioned just briefly that it really is the creation and sustaining of inclusive cultures, inclusive teams, where people come to work or school every day, do the best learning, do the best work of their lives, and they don't feel as if they have to leave some part of that behind. They are included. And as inclusive leaders, and I'm going to start referring to all of us as inclusive leaders because that is my utmost goal, that we all walk away with one thing, just one thing that we can do after this session to increase inclusivity on the teams or in the organizations that we lead. And a couple sort of opening context slides. One is that oftentimes we talk about as leaders, a culture is something that we have. We have a debate culture. We hear that a lot in tech. Oh, we love to debate. Or we have a very open culture, or hierarchical culture, or a fun-loving culture, or we celebrate, whatever it is we say about our cultures. But really, culture is not something you can just state, put it on a shelf, and let it marinate, right? It is something that you do every single day. Really, a culture are the norms, the values, the actions, everything that are reinforced every day and how things are done on our teams and in our organizations. And so it's very important to make it action-oriented and not definitional, if you will. The second slide, if we can move to that one, is really important to all of us as people bring intersecting, what they would say, intersecting identities to work, to school, to our personal lives. And this is just a graphic to sort of bring that out, the different types of identities we all have, multiple identities we all have. And when we talk about intersectionality as a word, we're talking about that being these types of intersecting identities. So an inclusive culture would make us all, independent of our identities, really feel welcome, not standing out, and not feeling like we can't contribute our best ideas. And that would be the end definition of an inclusive culture. However, we know in tech, and we're going to be talking about tech as a culture, we know in tech that a number of groups have been historically marginalized. Women, one. Certainly Black women, for example, another. Or tech is known to be extremely ageist, also. for example. So we know that, and we need to be looking at building inclusive cultures through the lens of historically marginalized groups. So this isn't just a big kumbaya moment like, oh, let's all get along and go to work and be happy. We are going to have to do some hard work, build an inclusive culture, learning through the lens of those groups who have been historically marginalized in tech. So although we may be talking about this group or that group, it's important to understand that we're all different and we all have intersecting identities within those groups. And with that, we'll move to the next slide, and I'm going to hand it back over to Nancy. Wait. I forgot something really important, that we have organized this talk in terms of inclusive leadership in 10 different sections, each one starting with a C, just to be clever. And so we wanted to talk about it in those sections just as a way to kind of organize it and talk about what inclusive leaders do. All right, Nancy, there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lucy. And you know, what a great way to start. Committed. I don't think anything great happens unless you have a committed group of individuals and teams to actually make something happen. And as we move to the next slide, how do we demonstrate commitment? Well, we demonstrate commitment every single day. It's not something that we are in a position to allow to come in and out. It's no different. I mean, none of you would be in the seats you are in if you weren't committed to solving problems and leading projects every day. So think about this like no other project, like any other project that you may be engaged in. Diversity and inclusion is like any other business issue. It requires people to take ownership, develop a plan, execute on the plan, and measure your success along the way. Pretty simple, right? You know, it seems like a simple concept, but the toughest question in most companies is who owns it? And I think what we'd like to say is that basically all of us do. And as we move to the next slide, what I mean by that is what you're going to see here is that it looks like a hot potato a little bit, doesn't it? You champion responsibility in others. And so when less than half, 45% of executives surveyed feel personally responsible for inclusivity, though they believe the responsibility falls to the business leader, 75%, you can see where, you know, and one of the worst things as a CEO that I used to hear is it's not in my job description. You know, it just can't always be somebody else's job. We just can't wait for it to simply come from your diversity and inclusion department. This needs to be all of our problems. So it requires all of us to not only take on the responsibility, but to champion others to do so also. You know, when change is truly needed, influence is far more powerful and enduring than authority. And so Lucy talked about culture being something you do. What I found is that great leaders create cultures that drive desired behaviors that lead to the results you want. And if you want an inclusive culture, you must be part of the solution. It starts with each of us. And so this is really about our individual commitment to being inclusive. Lucy?
Yeah, so let's move to the next slide. And as we're doing that, I wanted to also reinforce something that Nancy said. Research does show that this one particular thing around personal commitment of technology leaders is one of the main reasons why D&I efforts fail in technology organizations. Generally, at what we see from NCWIT is that a lot of technology leaders in some sense outsource or advocate to HR and D&I, when in fact they should be building inclusive cultures in their organizations as a technology leader, because that's where inclusive cultures start. And that's where they grow, and that's where they thrive. So more to say about that.
Well, I think similarly, Lucy, just to jump in, yeah. I mean, you know, culture isn't your HR department's responsibility. And so why we think that it needs to be advocated to departments and or sort of these siloed areas versus it needs to be a groundswell within the organizations you represent. We all own culture.
That's exactly right. All right, so the next C, inclusive leaders are, hold on a minute, why is my phone ringing? There, sorry. Inclusive leaders are cognizant. So this was a bit of a stretch of the C metaphor, but this means that inclusive leaders are informed. And we don't have to all get PhDs in social science to have the information that we need to be inclusive leaders. But I wanted to run through just a few of the types of things that you can know and should know as an inclusive leader, and also point to a resource on our site called Women in IT, the Facts, which is a compendium of all kinds of information. It's a pretty quick read, has lots of graphs, pretty pictures, but a lot of the information that you would need to be a cognizant inclusive leader. So let's move on to the next slide. Oh, look at that. The quote's gone. Uh-oh. Okay, well, I know what it says. So this is a quote from Scott Page in his work called The Difference, and also the Gender Diversity Bonus. Scott Page is a PhD researcher. He uses analytical modeling to prove that diverse teams solve complex problems faster and arrive at better solutions than homogeneous teams if they're properly led, which gets us back to why we're all talking today, becoming inclusive leaders. This work is really groundbreaking in that he used a lot of scientific algorithms to really get to this conclusion, and he's not the only one. Catherine Phillips and others have research to show that diverse teams produce better results. Not too surprising when you start to think about groupthink or, homogeneous teams coming to the decision table with pretty much the same life experience often. So we need different lived experiences at the technology design table. So that research is pretty solid. Let's move on. You would know why we're doing this. And one answer is innovation, better products, better solutions, better access for customers, all the kinds of things we care about as business leaders and implementers. So that's one reason to care. Of course, there are other reasons to care, like workforce numbers, well-paying jobs, creative jobs, all the kinds of things that we also care about from a social perspective. You would also start to know some of these data, and you might not know them right to the percentage point, but you would know the general trend. And so you would know, for example, that there are certain representation numbers. These are US numbers, but there's no reason to think they're different in most of the rest of the world. And the message to take from this slide is sort of this inverted pyramid, if you will, where when we look in the US, you can see women make up over half of all professional occupations, but when you start looking deeper into computing, you start to see that the percentages become less and less. Right? So this is just one sort of representation metric. Let's go to the next one. I'll show you another one. This is on intersectionality and race and gender. And it's really important as we start to think about inclusive cultures that we start to break down some of these overall metrics into certain smaller groups. For example, like what are our racial metrics? What about age? What about this? What about that? This happens to represent women of color, and you can again see the declining percentage. One other fact here, we also know that women make up less than 5% of all technology leadership positions, CTO, architect, fellow, vice president, et cetera. And they have an attrition rate from the private sector of 56% by mid-career. And they're not leaving, and y'all know this, they're not leaving often for family responsibilities. They're leaving a culture. They're leaving company cultures where they feel like they cannot progress. Let's keep going. So those are what we would call participation metrics. This would be an influence and innovation metric. This is a patenting study that NCWIT runs. We use software to crawl the US patent database, and we assign a gender to each IT patent over the last 30 years. And you can see this, the categories over on the left. And then we look at, are women patenting their ideas in tech? And if you want to get right to the bottom line and look at the male-only teams down in the bottom right, you see about 87.4% of all IT patents over the last 30 years have male-only invention teams, where that would be one or more men on the team. So we're pretty sure we know why this is the case. And you can look at female only or women only. You can see 2.1%. The rest are mixed. It's because they're not in the roles that lead to patenting. Yes, they could be being overlooked and contributed to the patent and didn't get named. They might not know how to patent. All those things are true. But we also believe that there's what they call a role segregation going on in tech for women, and they're not even in the roles that lead to patenting. This is what we would call an innovation metric. We have a lot more of these, but we don't have time to go through them all. So it's important to understand the difference as an inclusive leader about, okay, let's look at representation, but hey, it matters what they're doing. We want them to be influencing the technology, products, and solutions of the future. We want them in lead execution roles and not only in lead creative roles and not only in support roles, right? We want them across the board. So let's keep going. Thank you. Last thing you know is this general body. So you know the business case, you know some data and stats, and you also know why. You have a sense of why this is happening, and we don't have enough time to go through a lot of the bias work, and I'm sure many of you in your companies have gone through unconscious bias training or have read about it, but this is a fundamental thing to integrate as an inclusive leader, that bias exists in all of us, men and women both. It's out there in our society. We bring it to work. It's in our it's institutionalized, and it's in ourselves. And it wasn't something. We're born with it as humans. There's a lot to say about that, but it's decision making. It's all in very human, but we are still very biased. And in this case, we're very, very biased about who does tech, both men and women. You can recognize it, and it so happens it's easier to recognize it in others than yourself. So it's really good to work with a buddy on this, to really start to look at that as a team. And then it needs a response. And this is really important. If we do not respond to bias either now or later, it gets normalized. And so I would say that the thing about this is there's a lot to know about bias. It's not that hard to learn it. You can install all kinds of best practices on your team to make sure that we are understanding things from a research-based perspective. And in the end, before I turn it back over to Nancy, I want to say we can look at all this data, but here's the real motivating thing for me. It can be depressing to look at these data, but just think when we really fix this, when we all address this together, men and women both, and we get diverse people at technology design table, just imagine what we could create. Technology is pretty good anyway right now as far as I'm concerned, but just think what the world would get: richer, deeper, more accessible, more interesting technology products and services. That to me is the upside here. So dwelling on data, yes. However, remember the real upside, at least for me, is wow, think what's possible. Back to you, Nancy.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more, Lucy. Those stats, in many regards, always make me a little bit sad. But what I've seen in working with you over the last decade plus is real change is happening. And I think that's really the fundamental thing. So as we move to the next slide, the key here is that we take a comprehensive approach. The opportunity for us to not only look from an individual perspective, but from a system perspective. And as we move to the next slide, where we really want to focus is, as Lucy said, around, this one's not looking too good either. But what I'll talk a little bit about is fixing the system, not the groups of people. We all have shortcuts. As Lucy said, we all have unconscious bias. We all have shortcuts or schemas that help us make sense of the world. It's just a fact. But unfortunately, our shortcuts sometimes make us misinterpret or miss things. And that's unconscious bias. And as Lucy said, we all have it. Yes, sexism, ageism, racism, and on and on. It's been on full display. in many regards, in both organizations and in the world in general. As Lucy said, we bring it to work every single day. We need to be aware of it. Understanding that each of us does have this unconscious bias is the first step in changing the system, though. And, you know, what surprised me, I think, a little bit was that the research does show that women are equally biased as men as to who does tech. And so we've got to take a responsibility as we think about how we move forward. You know, one of the things is that I you know, as much as we all work hard in terms of our own professional development every single day, what I want to emphasize is we are not broken. Minority groups are not broken. We are working within a system that needs to be fixed. And when we start to really analyze that the system is where we need to focus versus the individuals, and that also goes that majority groups, men, white men, are not the enemy here. They are an opportunity to be advocates and supporters as they recognize and learn and acknowledge that the system needs to change. And so as we move to the next slide, you know, I'm thrilled that over the years of development at the National Center for Women in IT, this change model was developed. And this is the NCWIT change model that is now part of the Tech Inclusion Journey program that is being implemented across a broad spectrum of companies, many in technology across the country. This is many, many years of work and best practices and learnings to say, how would we put this into a system to start to break down the components that we need to focus in on and work on to improve inclusion. And this really, I think, is a game changer from my perspective, this system and approach. You know, the key is not only identifying and executing around areas like recruitment and retention, development, and sponsorship, stopping bias in its tracks every single day, but it is also about measuring improvements and increasingly driving transparency internally and externally. And so this system really kind of transcends, in my view, the technology sector. This, quite frankly, equally applies to all sectors and can become a roadmap that can be integrated into any organization. I get a lot of comfort by having a systematic approach, a system that you can take a look at, break down, and evaluate so that we can take a much more comprehensive approach. So as we move to the next slide, in achieving any type of change in a system, I think you need to deconstruct the elements. Again, this is something we do every single day in other facets of our business. And so why not apply the same approach? So examine how you are operating and with data in hand, transform and reconstruct to improve and get the outcome you're looking for. You know, this is something deconstructing, examining, transforming, and reconstructing, again, is something that you do every day in business. Why not apply it here as well? And so a good example is when we started Rallyday, which I'm a managing director in. We spent a year building the platform, which is unheard of in private equity because they typically are focused on raising money and investing in new companies. But we actually wanted to build a platform that would become quite enduring, and that we built it around the system that would allow us to continue to ground how we operated as an organization and how we continue to iterate and improve in our performance as team members and as investors in other companies. And so it was a little bit of, you know, let's drink our own champagne. If we were going to be a best practice for the companies we were investing in, we needed to take the time and energy to do that. So as we built that out, we spent a lot of time asking, you know, why at every single turn. whether it was our recruiting, whether it was our interviewing, whether it was our performance evaluation, and how we were going to create good communications amongst the team, common language approach. The spirit of inquiry allowed us to put an improved set of practices in place that would help us achieve our objectives of creating a culture of true inclusion. And so it's a little bit of putting your money where your mouth is. If you really believe this provides you an edge and opportunity from an innovation perspective, you need to take the time to invest in creating a foundation and a system that is enduring. With that, I'll turn it over to Lucy.
Thanks, and we'll go to the next slide. And you know, again, just to say that as inclusive leaders, all of those areas Nancy was talking about in the change model benefit from senior leadership and managerial support, right? So that's why it's so important, this topic of leadership, to making progress in all of those areas. So we can put a lot of effort, say, in performance appraisals, but if we don't have top leadership support and inclusive cultures, it may not be as effective. So moving on, inclusive leaders are also curious and currently wear cute little red glasses. So let's move on to the next slide. And Nancy mentioned the spirit of inquiry, and you know, I'm just going to quickly go through this because I feel as if it's clear what it is, but it's very underused as a technique, right? The spirit of inquiry and curiosity are really important to being an inclusive leader because it's a method by which we can remain collegial. We don't have to be buzzkills in meetings. You know, we can really address, remember we talked about addressing bias, or it becomes normalized. And you can do that by asking a question. So if somebody says in a meeting, well, Lucy's just not a natural born leader, rather than jumping on them and saying, well, yes, she is, well, actually, yes, she is, but I'm saying that, you know, it's be better to say, well, what do you mean by that? Because people say a lot of things that they don't know what they really mean. They're just saying them. And when you start to explore that, or when you start to explore other things and just ask a question, just one, you're going to find out that you're going to learn something, or they're going to learn something, or both. And that's sort of this really nice process of starting to build trust, a sense of safety, a sense of how we're going to have these conversations with each other and not feel attacked. But questions and the spirit of inquiry is probably one of the single most important things you can do as an inclusive leader, and it's free. And it's easy to ask a question rather than confront somebody. So with that, I'll just move to the next slide. And it's also the case when you are an inclusive leader and you start asking questions about things, you can also start to challenge what you think of as a checkbox solution. So Nancy just went through systemic change, organized, strategic, looking at the whole system. There are a lot of sort of reported solutions to diversity and inclusion in tech that really are not helpful. And in fact, they could do damage. And we call them checkbox solutions. Okay, and so I'll just pick on one of them. Let's send all our women to confidence training. Okay, well, okay, I think there's some people, men and women, who could probably really understand confidence and maybe, you know, have a more confident interaction style, if you will. Great, that's called professional development. That is not called D&I. And it sends a message that women aren't confident. And then we start to believe we're not confident also. Right? So that's a checkbox solution. Inclusive leaders need to start asking, well, why do we think that is going to build an inclusive culture for us? And it sends a message in terms of what Nancy just said about somehow women are broken. Right? So this is what I mean by starting to challenge some of these things. And then last slide in this section, this is it. If y'all just leave this meeting and do this when it comes to D&I, you can do it for everything, you know, and not just on behalf of other women or other, you know, minority groups, but for everybody. Asking a question is really a great technique as a leader anyway. Back to you, Nancy.
I love to tackle the courage question. So moving into courageous. It's interesting. I like to think of it as we won't be deterred by what we are scared of. And yes, D&I can be a little scary because we don't talk about it enough. It's just not part of our common language. Again, it sort of sits sometimes in very large organizations as this, head of D&I, but, why not talk about diversity and inclusion? So why does it need to be scary, and why do we need courage? I don't think it needs to be scary if we make it safe and we have a common vocabulary. So as we move to the next slide, we have to somehow find a way to normalize this. It just needs to be part of what we do every day. It's out there. We know we have unconscious bias. And as a matter of fact, at my firm today, we regularly call each other out in our Monday morning firm meetings when we see bias enter the conversation. We start with a very simple, take this the right way, framing it in the positive versus the negative, don't take this the wrong way. By simply setting that trigger of take this the right way, this common language prompt lets us all know this is coming from a place of genuine care for improving how we work together. So I want to encourage you to think about ways and techniques that simply become safe, they're not risky, that we have a common language that we can prompt each other, feel comfortable with. We know we all have these biases, and the ability to just raise them in a way that becomes not confrontational, but in the spirit of wanting us to communicate and collaborate more effectively together. So I guess that's our bias busting technique that I would deploy for us. Moving on to the next slide. I'm sure many of these are all too familiar for many of you. My favorite and perhaps most pervasive is being repeatedly interrupted in meetings. At my firm, we started an I jar, which is basically the interruption jar. Stay calm and don't interrupt. We actually put a monetary number on it, $20 for every interruption. And in the early days, the jar would fill very quickly. I must note that the jar is definitely not quite as full as it used to be. But it's amazing how we all became quickly conscious of what we were doing, all of us, in terms of just interrupting each other, speaking over one another, and really not progressing the conversation. But having the conversation, or having the courage to have the conversation openly with teammates, just made it that much easier to actually improve the way we operated. So what can you do? It starts with implementing change personally, as we talked about at the beginning of this session. Monitor interruptions and pay attention to whose voices are heard in team meetings. The most senior person in the room doesn't need to speak first, maybe last. And normalize regular team discussions related to bias. This is what we should be doing. Interrupt personality penalties, statements about fit or natural leaders. And just ask one question, as Lucy said. What makes you think that? I wonder how task assignment happens. Just the inquiry allows each to just simply participate in the conversation versus feeling that they're being pointed out. So this is just a great, I would encourage you to take this slide and some of these scenarios and practice them amongst your team. They're great ways to help think about how you would respond or ask a question. Moving on to the next slide. Bottom line here is that unconscious bias has a pretty big impact. It is not inconsequential. We can talk about it very openly, but please recognize it does have an impact that can be quite destructive. It is all of our responsibility to recognize it is there and what we can do individually to change. These are some pretty powerful figures that I think only reinforce why it's important that we all take action individually. With that, I'll turn it back over to Lucy.
Thanks. And we're getting close to the end. These final sections go a little faster, so we want to leave some time for questions. This next section builds on a number of the prior ones. Inclusive leaders are creative. On the next slide, I'll just tell you a little story about that. This gets back to the spirit of inquiry and asking questions and not just assuming something. So this is the story about why we don't have more women in technology leadership positions. So lots and lots of companies have really worked on this, not very effectively, I might say, and have assumed that it's because women often don't want leadership positions, or they're not going to apply for them, or and some of that could be true, of course. Some women maybe don't want them, but they haven't really looked more deeply at why it's the case. Some of it is because the attrition rate for technical women is so pitiful in private sector tech companies, but some of it's not. And when you dig into the data and you become creative about solutions, you start to see that role segregation that I talked about, that research increasingly shows that when women and other groups underrepresented in computing, the minute they walk in the door, they're subtly encouraged into certain types of roles. And those roles happen to be the ones that don't ordinarily get promoted up the technology ladder. So then you start really saying, oh, wow, how could I really start looking at that? Well, once companies start to really look at task assignment and other types of processes, and they can get their hands around it, but we don't really know a company yet that really takes good care of that conversation yet. But they're beginning to see it and do something about it so that we can actually get members of underrepresented groups in those lead creative roles and up the technology ladder, right? But if task assignment isn't working, then we have a much less chance of getting that to happen. And so next slide, please. I just did this, so I can turn it back over to Nancy. Back to you, Nancy.
I get the best, the caring slide. So with love, I'd love to move on to the next slide. And, stereotype threat shows up in different ways. People are reluctant to defend their ideas. They're reluctant to take on leadership positions. They're overly harsh about their own work. They discount their performance. All of those things are really not bringing out the very best in the opportunity for teams to work more effectively and for individuals to rise within the organizations that they participate in. I think, we talk about encouragement as being such a paramount thing. What I would say is don't mistake the need for encouragement with a lack of confidence. And we talked about confidence earlier. I think there's plenty of confidence around. You can have a ton of confidence and very much feel excluded. And so I can't tell you the times early in my career, and as you know, I've been in technology and infrastructure. I would sit in a room of men and I hesitated to speak up, whether it was sharing an idea, a perspective, how would I be received? Would I be heard? Would my idea potentially get hijacked? I had a lot of things running through my mind as I sat in a room that I didn't feel as comfortable in. No one looked like me. And so what I did have, though, is the good fortune of having some sponsors in my corner that encouraged me. And so as leaders, what I've learned, one of the most important things and potentially the greatest gift we can give is our genuine encouragement and support. I can't tell you how much it unleashes talent and creates incredible outcomes. I have seen it in action, and it becomes almost the X factor in team performance. simply said, it is a game-changing opportunity for every single leader. It is very simple, yet important in terms of really encouraging others in a very genuine way. This allows people to rise, be that much more feeling of inclusion, and being part of a support organization that they feel that they can go and say things and speak up and be part of it. And so, if you feel excluded, encouragement can be that game changer in terms of how people feel like they can contribute in the organization far more effectively.
Absolutely. And I would say this is the second thing to maybe take away that you can do right now. The first one is use a spirit of inquiry, just ask one question. The second is offer legitimate encouragement to everybody, really, but it's really, really important for groups that are underrepresented. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to the next slide. Inclusive leaders are civil. Let's keep going. This is research by Christine Parath and others that pretty recent research, but that civil environments really, or uncivil environments, I should say, really have a drag effect on productivity, on innovation in organizations. And so people who are on the receiving end of uncivil behavior, and some of that is interrupting or really kind of being sort of a really aggressive kind of culture, they're going to produce fewer ideas and they're going to have much, much lower commitment to the company. The other interesting part of her research shows that those who witness this have a similar set of negative drags on them, including wanting to help other people. They just don't really want to be on the receiving end of this, and so they moderate their own behavior as well, right? And this gets to this notion, too, that tech does tend to have a little bit of an alpha sort of, culture attributed to it, if you will, and interruptions and, in some sense, being less than civil is part of our culture as technologists. And so we need to keep looking at that in terms of building inclusive cultures. And interruptions is a big one. Nancy already talked about that. And we have a lot of experience now at tech companies where if all they do is monitor interruptions and see who says what and who's not being heard, it goes a long way towards building inclusive culture and getting better ideas out.
Yeah.
So, Nancy, back to you.
Well, yeah, no, and I just wanted to add, Lucy, Brittany on the chat mentioned, and I thought it was great, another thing I love is instead of calling each other out, we call each other in as a way to help each other get into the culture. So thank you, Brittany. Well said. All right, moving on to consistent. And if we could move to the next slide. As I reflected on consistency, what I've learned along the way is it is far less about the big milestones. I mean, everybody talks about huge milestones in their life, and what I have learned as a CEO, an entrepreneur, and business builder over the many years, it's far more about embracing and celebrating the thousands of little wins along the way. Your journey, all of our journey to be inclusive leaders will not be a sprint. It's not like, gee, Nancy and Lucy just gave me the 10 easy steps to becoming an inclusive leader. It will, it's just not going to happen with one big momentous event or, I've now got it and I figured it out. But many, many small, incredibly impactful steps you take along the way to change your culture, and as Lucy says, if you walk away with simply having the courage to ask a question or simply, provide support and encouragement to somebody, that may seem like a very small thing, but it can have a tremendous impact and change. So I like to say I'm still proudly working on my 10,000 hours of mastering inclusive leadership. And my hope is one day I achieve it, but recognize that it will be the consistency over time in terms of how we operate, and hopefully it simply becomes second nature to us.
Absolutely.
All right, Lucy.
All right. So
it's all about the community.
We're to the 10th and final characteristic of inclusive leaders, and we've made this case all along as in terms of being community minded, all hands on deck, team sport. And we see a lot of efforts where diversity and inclusion efforts are generally handled by people who are underrepresented themselves. And that is not a recipe for success. And it's unfair and a burden to groups that are already underrepresented, having to also feel the responsibility for improving underrepresentation in their team or in their company. So this is just a final appeal to include everybody. We're talking about inclusive cultures as a whole, systemic change. When you're doing that, you're doing it on behalf of everybody. Everybody benefits when you have better interviewing processes. Everybody benefits when you have different performance appraisal processes. Everybody benefits from encouragement and from interruption. And you can just sort of in maybe a little funny way, I have never heard anybody say, thank you for interrupting me. I had nothing intelligent to say. Or I really don't want any encouragement. Thank you very much. This is human work on behalf of everybody, and it requires everybody in. And I love the comment about, let's call everybody in. That really summarizes this perfectly. So I'll just wrap up then if you want to move to the summary slide, and we should have a couple minutes for questions. So hopefully if you have any, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and if we don't get to them, we will follow up with answers for you. So this is really about being inclusive leaders. We're not fixing people so much. We're fixing or really addressing culture, building inclusive cultures. Yes, there probably are some people who need to be fixed. Overt bias is illegal. That needs to be fixed. But in general, we're really, as we're building inclusive cultures, we're dealing with unconscious types of phenomena. So we know we have to take a systemic and strategic approach. Corollary, not checkbox. We need to be looking at not only numbers of who's participating, but what are we doing? What is the work? How is it feeding the innovation of the future? Blame is really not all that helpful. So again, it's like an all hands on deck sort of collegial effort. And really, these aren't women's issues or Blacks' issues. This is really about building an inclusive culture. So going to the next slide real quick. These are the 10 C's. Sometimes when we give this in person, we give you a test. But we don't have time for that, so we won't give you a test. And then next slide. This pretty much says it all. This is a real road sign that I think someone was trying to sell real estate or something. And, so it's right by a busy highway. But it says it to us too. You are not stuck in traffic. You are the traffic. And we're not stuck in a culture. We are the culture. Everything we do, everything we say, everything we address, everything we don't address, all of that is very important to the culture. We are the culture. And as leaders and as inclusive cultures, we will build that culture through actions, large and small. And so with that, I thank you. And I think we have a few questions. So Elena, are you back on?
I am back on. Thank you so much, ladies. That was such an insightful conversation. So many good takeaways. I love that last tidbit about being stuck in traffic. We're the traffic, and we've got to work together to fix it. So we are a little over the hour, but I do want to make sure that we get a few questions covered, and then Lucy, Nancy will work with you to post the rest in like a blog post or something on our website. So let's get to this one real quick. If you were to recommend one change as individuals that we could initiate tomorrow, what would that be?
Well,
I have a long list, so Lucy, maybe
well,
we might not have enough time.
just one where we talked about 3 pretty easy things to do as individuals. And out of those, it's hard for me to choose my favorite. So I'm going to answer the question a little differently and say I would do all 3. I would really start to practice the spirit of inquiry. It's amazing how well it works. I would start to notice my peers who really, had we stopped and weren't quite so busy, could really feel good about getting some legitimate encouragement. And I would also really start monitoring interruptions, including your own. I used to be a pretty big interrupter, and because our culture was one like that. But I learned that was really not very helpful to lots of things. So Nancy, did you want to say anything else?
Yeah, no, I agree. My goodness, I filled the eye jar here with the interruptions that I made, and certainly became very cognizant of it. I would say encouragement, and I will say it for this reason. I think we have become so busy, and we have so many demands, and we are running literally in this day and age from one Zoom to the next. Or Blue Jean, or whatever it might be. But we need to stop and breathe. It's a little bit of slowing down to speed up. And what I mean by that is absolutely sitting down and thinking about you as a leader. What will you do this week, this month, to genuinely encourage people around you? It is a very simple thing. It is a powerful thing, and when done in a way that is consistent and received in a genuine way, I think it is one of the most powerful things you can do as a leader. And so, in my mind, if there was one thing as leaders that you could go do today, I know you've got a list that could be very long of people that you could go encourage and support. And as we're in this frenetic world we are today, taking the time to do that is a very powerful mechanism that is at your disposal.
That's great. Well, thank you so much again, and we just appreciate so much you taking the time to come and chat to the community. We will be posting this session on the website, so in case anybody missed it, if you want to be able to share that later, we will post it shortly. And we'll get through some of these questions at a later point too, just so that you guys can see some of those answers come back. There was so much information today. So thank you again. We also want to thank Rogers. Christine, thank you so much for your participation today and your sponsorship, and the rest of our 2020 sponsors. NCWIT, the organization, has created a lot of resources and toolkits that are available, and they really encourage other organizations to take advantage of those throughout their journey to inclusive leadership and more diverse organizations. So please do check out NCWIT. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see everybody in 2021.
It's an honor, and you guys rock. Keep going. Congratulations. Thank you.